In this video, I want to talk a bit about the differences between Diablo 2 and Diablo 3. There's a lot of discussion centered around this throughout the years and why a lot of people like Diablo 2 better and why they feel like Diablo 3 went the wrong direction. And a lot of that's being reflected in the way Diablo 4 is being developed. You're seeing a change, it going back to some of the things that Diablo 2 did well. So in this video, I just want to talk about that. And for those of you that are coming into Diablo 2 for the first time, this is going to give you sort of an overview of what you can expect with the game. First off, I want to talk about the loot system. This is probably one of the biggest differences between the two games. I think Diablo 2 has arguably one of the best loot systems in any of the ARPGs ever made, and that's because of things like runes and rune words and the way sockets work. In Diablo 2, you can get these things called runes, which are essentially drops that you can slot into sockets on equipment that give you different bonuses depending on the runes that they are. They might give you like poison damage or increase your armor or increase your health, give you lifesteal, things like this. But when combined in certain orders with certain equipment, you also get what are called rune words, which are specific items that basically become uniques or, their own specific item if you slot these in the right order. What this did was create an item economy that was centered around runes, and in fact, they became the currency that was used at endgame to trade equipment. Some of the more rare runes being very, very valuable and were hard to acquire, that allowed to create some very, very powerful items. But also what this did is it created scenarios where you'd have to check items that dropped constantly because, for instance, if you got a staff with 2 sockets, maybe you wanted to make the leaf rune word, you could do that with it. But if you had a staff with 3 sockets, you can't. So in this case, the staff with 2 sockets is actually better for if you're trying to make that exact rune word over the one with 3. So you're maybe looting things that you wouldn't normally loot because they have value to what you're trying to create. Another difference is that Diablo 2 features unique items instead of legendary items. Unique items are sort of a precursor to legendaries. They basically are an item that has its own visual appearance that's different than the rest, has its own name, and has its own set of stats that's separate from other weapons in that same category. Both games also feature sets which show up green, which allow you to get more and more bonuses as you equip more and more pieces. Feels like to me that Diablo 3 was focused more around with their builds around these items than Diablo 2 was. Diablo 2 seems, if I remember correctly, to be built more around the combination of runes, rune words, uniques, and your sets instead of rather just focusing on one set and then piling a couple legendaries on where you could. And probably the last thing I want to talk about the loot system is that rares in Diablo 3 don't feel rare at all. You get them constantly. Rares in Diablo 2 are much more rare than they are in Diablo 3. At least early on in the game, they become a lot more common later on as your magic find and whatnot goes up. Why this probably makes more sense in Diablo 2 than Diablo 3 is that the drop rates in Diablo 2 are drastically lower, meaning that you're probably not going to find all the items in Diablo 2 unless you grind for thousands and thousands of hours in the game without trading. Whereas in Diablo 3, you can probably kit out one of your classes in maybe a few dozen hours if you grind really well, or maybe a little bit longer if you need. But rares are actually rare in Diablo 2. The next thing I want to talk about is the differences in class and character progression between Diablo 2 and Diablo 3. In Diablo 3, you would essentially just gain some stats automatically when you leveled up, and you would unlock a new skill or skill runes for the skills that you had, so you could change them slightly. And if you wanted to change them, you would just go change them. And it was basically handled for you automatically. In Diablo 2, you gain attribute points that you need to designate how you want to spend them or save them for later, as well as a skill point that you can spend in one of your 3 class skill trees. One of the reasons I really love Diablo 2, and I think people who have played both games find Diablo 2's character progression better, and one of the reasons I think Diablo 4 is headed back in that direction, is that you feel more involved with your character. You get to choose where to spend your attribute points. You get to choose where to spend your skill tree points. You can save them for later if you don't know, and then make decisions later on as well. So it feels like you're more involved, and you get to decide what's happening with your character rather than it happening automatically, and then you just kind of tweaking your character around. Probably what makes this more involved is the limited respecs that you have in Diablo 2. You have 1 per difficulty, and then there's an item at endgame that you can farm that allows you to respec, but it's very rare. So you're not going to be able to respec at will, at least not immediately, unless you get some of these items or trade for them later on. So your decisions are going to be very, very important what you make with your character. Now, initially, I thought this was one of the things that made Diablo 2 better, the fact that it had a lack of respecs, because at launch you couldn't even respec, and I felt like it made it so, your decisions were permanent. It was very important. But as I've gotten older and I have less time to game, which seems weird because I do work in the gaming industry, free time to just play at my own discretion, being able to respec at will is not so bad. I know that people out there probably still prefer having meaningful decisions when it comes to progression, and I'm absolutely for that. I'm glad with Diablo 4 it's going back that way. But having a way to respec regularly would not hurt my feelings just because I have less time. I know that's totally selfish, but that's the truth for me. Additionally, Diablo 2 doesn't feature any sort of paragon system like Diablo 3, so once you hit level cap, if you ever get there, which is a long, long way at 99, you're not going to be able to continue to progress your character. It's going to be very rare for the average player to ever hit that for them, and realistically, they'll probably get somewhere around 60 or 70, if that, maybe 80, and then they'll switch characters and make a new character and play a different class. That's generally how this game goes, and you make lots and lots of different builds because you can't respec very effectively, so you're going to be playing a lot of different characters. The next thing I want to talk about is combat and gameplay. Diablo 2 is a much slower ARPG when it comes to combat than Diablo 3. In Diablo 3, usually a lot of classes, jump into combat, get in the middle of a pack of enemies, AoE everything down, things look grim, jump out, heal up, jump back in, and this sort of repeats over and over. That's just not the case in Diablo 2. Usually in Diablo 2, you're either getting into a pack of enemies and trying to stay alive in the middle of them, or you're just kind of hanging out on the fringes and trying to nuke them down before you go into the middle of them all. There are probably a couple reasons for this. First, the elite packs in Diablo 3 have much more complicated effects than Diablo 2, and a lot of them are much more dangerous, revolving around using your mobility to get out of the way so you don't take damage, because at harder difficulties, you can't just stand there and tank it in most cases. You actually have to move out of the way. Diablo 2 is kind of the opposite in that way, where it doesn't have as many advanced effects, but it's relying on your gear and the way you've set up your gear in order to avoid or negate damage, so you can sit there and tank that damage in a lot of cases. Sort of piggybacking off the topic of gameplay and combat, I want to talk a bit about endgame. In Diablo 3, currently at the end of the game, you're going to run rifts and greater rifts or do bounties, which is going to provide you with unique loot and ways to further increase your character level with Paragon, etc. So that's what you kind of do right now with Diablo 3 at endgame. Or at least it was the last time I played, which is about a couple years ago. Diablo 2 doesn't have an endgame, in the modern sense, meaning it doesn't have content after you finish the game that unlocks for you to play once you've finished. If you've played Outriders at all recently, you know that there's like expeditions you can do once you reach the end of the game. Path of Exile has maps once you get done with the game. Diablo 3 has rifts. Diablo 2 doesn't have anything like that. In fact, what you do usually after you finish Diablo 2 is you farm specific bosses for specific items. So if you're a player coming from Path of Exile, you're coming from Diablo 3, and you're wondering what's the end game, the end game is farming bosses that you've already defeated until you get the items to farm them faster, until you get items to farm them even faster. So in that sense, it doesn't have an end game like those games do, and you might be disappointed by that. Another thing I want to talk about, and this is probably something that's been brought up by a lot of people comparing the games, is the aesthetics of the two games. Diablo 2 and even Diablo 1 had a much darker and horrific aesthetic than Diablo 3. I felt like Diablo 3 went in a bit of a different direction with the art style that they wanted to use, and whereas in Diablo 1 and Diablo 2, everything felt very horrifying, scary, it was very dreadful. It was borderline horror in the genre because of the amount of gore and blood in the dungeons. Things felt terrifying to open doors and go in certain places. Even more so in the resurrected version of the game in Diablo 2. I feel like they really nailed this element. But in Diablo 3, I feel like they sacrificed some of that horror to increase some of the fantasy elements of the game. And I feel like that was a really poor call, in my opinion. Fantasy in ARPGs has been done a lot, particularly recently. But fantasy is not something that's hard to do. Capturing that really dark horror is something I felt like made Diablo really unique. It's what really drew me to the game way back in 1998 originally. And it's probably something that hasn't been captivated by too many games since, and especially in role-playing games, is that really sense of dread and that, things are getting more and more grim as you progress the game. You really didn't have that with Diablo 3. And, going to Diablo 4, you're seeing that they're sort of trying to go back to that a bit. They realize the error there, and they're trying to make it a little bit more like Diablo 2 and Diablo 1 in that regard. So if you're coming from Diablo 3 to Diablo 2, you're going to notice a difference in art style. And I don't expect this to be a negative to you, especially if you're playing Resurrected for the first time and you haven't played the older version of Diablo 2, because it's just done so well. You're going to love it. One of the last things I want to talk about that sets them apart is persistent online connection. Diablo 2, you didn't have to have a persistent online connection in order to play offline. I almost never played offline when I was playing back in the day. I never really got into that whole endgame online farming community, etc. that was, played thousands and thousands of hours. I probably played several hundred hours, but I never got that hardcore in it. I was pretty young at the time, and I was really into Fallout and those sort of games, so I spent a lot more time playing those than Diablo 2. But you didn't have to be persistently online, meaning you could play Diablo 2 anywhere once you had the game downloaded if you're playing single player. Obviously, if you wanted to play online, you had to have an online connection. With Diablo 3, for some reason, Blizzard decided to add persistent online connection. I assume this was to prevent cheating or something of that nature, but it basically requires you to be active online all the time in order to play, at the launch of the game, almost everyone couldn't get into the game because of server issues and overload, which created problems and obviously animosity towards Blizzard. It's not as much of an issue now, obviously, because it's been, many, many years since then. But you still have to have a persistent online connection, even if you're playing single player, which means that you can't play anywhere you want, anytime you want. This is actually one of the things I'm dreading most about Diablo 4, because it's going to have a persistent online connection. Even though it probably doesn't have as much effect on people today as it did when Diablo 3 came out, which was almost a decade ago. It's still not something I really, really am looking forward to, because sometimes it's just nice to be in the middle of nowhere and be able to play a game. Doesn't happen that often, but it'd still be great to be able to do it. And the very last thing I want to mention is something that is not currently in the game in Diablo 3, but it's probably one of the bigger sore points, at least for me, with the game, which was the auction hall. They actually had a real money auction hall at one point where you could sell items. I sort of get the idea they were just trying to cut out the middleman. I don't know what their idea was behind this, but it effectively ruined Diablo 3 for me. The game became about, basically, you couldn't progress past a certain point of the game without getting better items. And the best way to do that was to just buy them off the auction hall. A bunch of people made money on that. That's fine, whatever. But it basically created an economy based around spending real dollars to progress the game, which is not what gaming should be about, in my opinion. I mean, if you're playing a free-to-play game and you spend real money to win, it's one thing. But if you buy a game and then you have to spend money to progress it, that's a whole nother thing entirely. I just think that was one of the worst decisions I've ever seen in gaming. And for a lot of people, it just left a bitter taste in their mouth. Obviously, that's since been removed from the game, and that is not a feature in Diablo 2, so you don't have to worry about that. Although there are plenty of sites out there where you can buy Diablo 2 items for money, so that is a thing. If you want to do that, it's up to you. But that's not a thing inside Diablo 2 itself, so that's something, thankfully, you don't have to look forward to, and obviously that is no longer Diablo 3. So just looking over these things and, through the fact that, Blizzard is sort of going back to a lot of the things that made Diablo good in Diablo 2 with Diablo 4, they're sort of going, okay, we made some mistakes with Diablo 3. Let's find the middle ground between Diablo 3 and Diablo 2 and see if we can make, the perfect Diablo game. I think is a good move. I'm not saying Diablo 2 is perfect. I'm not saying everything is wrong with Diablo 3, because I did have fun with Diablo 3, and there were a lot of good things with Diablo 3, particularly on console. I felt like by that point, the game was very, very good compared to where it was when it launched. But if you could find the middle ground between the two games, you'd probably have a very, very solid game. And that's hopefully what we'll get with Diablo 4. I hope this video has given you some insight on why I think Diablo 2 is a better game than Diablo 3 as a whole. That's not to say Diablo 3 hasn't done anything well, because it has, and that Diablo 2 is a perfect game because it's not. But I think, this gives you an idea of what you can expect coming into Diablo 2 for the first time. But I want to hear from you guys. What do you guys think? Did I get it right? Is Diablo 2 better than Diablo 3? What are some things I forgot to mention? What did I not include that you would have liked to see included here? What are the differences that make these games, or one game, better than the other? And what would you like to see in Diablo 4?